50 years, there has been a revolutionary change in the status of women. In most parts of the Western world, women can vote, own property, and practice any profession within their capabilities. Beauty, however, is still one of the chief attributes of women. The woman of today is trying to solve her problems in the way of the 20th century. Around her, she sees household aids of modern design, pressure cookers, freezers, tiny garbage disposal units, lightweight irons, and a host more. And she wants them all. But for many, the ideal kitchen is still only a dream. Whether it's careers or cradles or both, the woman of today in every field of activity welcomes these new plans for better living. Although she will never abandon her role as wife and mother, she looks forward to a greater share in the world of today and tomorrow. A world which can be an adventure in happiness.
Welcome to Bay Area Psychology. I shared this clip with you because I was struck by the overt message of support for women's progress with the accompanying pictures depicting the drudgery of this progress. And this was contrasted with the happiness of domesticity. Initially, I found it amusing. As psychiatrist Karen Horney noted in 1932, long before the feminist movement, there existed wide recognition that femininity in most cultures is much devalued and that frequent exaltation and idealization of women hardly masks the underlying contempt for them. In fact, anthropologists have observed that the devaluation of women in cultures is no less intense than the oppression of racial or ethnic minority groups. Harriet Goldhar Lerner points out that the oppression of women is unique, however, in one important respect. Women may participate as vigorously in their own depreciation as do men. Despite noted progress and female achievement on so many fronts, women who have succeeded have failed to bring other women with her into the male world and failed to bond with each other. To address impediments in female bonding and the urgency of doing so is Chris Newkirk, a feminist counselor, and Juliana Brooks, who is the organizer of the Women's Recovery Roundtable. Ladies, I want to thank you both very much for being with me today.
Thank you. Good to be here.
I wanted to share with you a research here that there was a study done in Boston in the 1980s of 182 men and 163 women of comparable age, education, and training and occupational level. And they were comparable in every way, except that the women earned significantly less on average than men, and most acknowledged sex discrimination as a serious problem. But only 13 women felt that they and all women had been shortchanged. And I thought I'd open by asking you, because this struck me, as why so many women declare themselves personally exempt from the kind of discrimination that they may see that exists for other women. Do any of you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I think that that doesn't surprise me when you hear those stats, because women internalize sexism, okay, of our culture. So I think it takes a long, long time for women to recognize, a lot of life experience for them to recognize how they themselves have internalized these beliefs about themselves as women. So that doesn't surprise me that they would view it that way, living in this culture.
Okay, so somehow seeing themselves as an exception to the rule.
Right.
And I also believe that, you know, internalized oppression of that nature is somewhat developmental for girls. I mean, it's occurring, you know, in subtle and overt ways from the time they're children up through their puberty into adolescence. You know, there's some feminist researchers that have done studies on girls at 9 and what happens to them at that crucial period of time in development, and how they have to make sort of a choice. And I'm not going to say it's a conscious choice, but to either continue to excel in school, or to continue to excel physically, or to put some things aside so they are a part of and accepted by the male-dominant society, even at that age, they're able to internalize, understand, maybe not articulate, the structure and their place in it.
Okay. I think you're referring to Gilligan's study, right? And in that study, of course, when they talk to the 9-year-old, it's interesting that the 9-year-old girl believes she can do anything. Absolutely anything. And then when you talk to her again at 14 or 15, she starts to verbalize her role in direct connectedness to how attractive she is to men. And I think it's really interesting to me. I think this is really definitely at the root of the epidemic in eating disorder in that age group, in our culture for young girls.
Absolutely. That whole sense about defining ourselves based on some sort of external standard.
Absolutely.
You know, talking about eating disorders reminds me of studies I've seen that have shown that ever since 1900, every 10 years, the female standard for beauty has decreased by 10 pounds. So we're getting thinner and thinner and thinner. And I know that there have been statements made that on a kind of political point of view, if we are starving ourselves and if we are busy at the gym, we are not available to participate in making economic and political decisions on our own behalf. And so, you know, as women, today's focus really is, you know, what has happened with us that we have not only participated in this, but perpetuated with the next generation. You know, and I know that one of the resources I checked was Reinventing Women, and I thought we'd take a look at a graphic and take a look at one of the points she talks about why the women's movement in general is sort of stalled. We've not progressed forward. Let's take a look at the first one. 3 causes of momentum. Loss of momentum is the failure of women to bond or to find a support system. You know, have either of you experienced this, either in your work or in the groups you may be associated with?
Well, I think the first thing that I want to comment on when I see that is that it's pretty insidious. It's a pretty sneaky statement in my own view.
Okay.
In that whenever we talk about failure of women to do thus, and thus, the red flags go off for me.
Okay.
This is a woman-blaming culture. And one of the things that women do is take responsibility, totally personal responsibility for their quote-unquote failure to bond. And what they will do with that is pathologize themselves. Well, therefore, I must be sick. Okay? And what's important is to examine as women the cultural restraints to bonding without making ourselves sick or failures.
Okay.
Because there are cultural restraints to bonding. The first thing I would say, and then maybe Juliana would like to say some things, but in my groups, when I work with women in women empowerment groups, one of the things I see is that 9-year-old or that 10-year-old little girl who was taught that she's in the world to compete with that little girl over there for the man. That her worth is contingent upon, you know, getting the good marriage, getting the catch. Okay, so that pits her against other women. She internalizes that unconsciously. And then when I see her when she's 42, she has a basic distrust of other women because she's viewed herself as being in competition with women.
Well, and if I can interrupt, that goes back to the status of women.
Yes.
I mean, throughout our culture, you know, originally really the only power base women had was to marry well.
Yes.
And I think that has continued at some levels for women. Even though we do have more choices, there is still that sort of, if we can find economic security in marrying well, which is what economic security means, then we've really done something for ourselves. Juliana.
Well, you know, the lack of bonding, or what was the exact term that they used?
Bonding.
Bonding.
No, was there a qualifier before that, like good bonding? Was there anything adequate bonding? You know, in comparison to what?
Yeah.
To male bonding? You know, in comparison to, you know, I'm going to again take it back to developmental tasks. Girls and boys socialize differently. Girls are much more individual players, where boys are collectively on teams and they learn a lot about interacting with one another. So what are we doing to encourage now, proactively encourage different styles, different ways, to create new ways of bonding for girls? How are mothers bonding in community now? How are we modeling to the women that are coming up now? You know, and I also think that a lot of the research that's done is done by men.
Oh, absolutely.
And it's done by men on men. So there hasn't been a lot of, I mean, more and more recently there's been some good studies on women. But so some of the stuff, like Chris, I take with like a grain of salt. You really have to use your critical thinking skills when you when you read the research, because you know, right away I'm thinking, you know, this study says, well, who paid for this study and who did the study, and you know, so.
And what does that mean? What does failure to bond mean?
Right.
I
Failure
see
to
women
bond.
bonding all the time. I see women creating systems. In the recovery movement, for example, I think the 12-step movement has been a leader in that, in confronting those old ideas about women as competitors, I guess, being joined in a joint goal of survival.
Then again, let me interrupt. That one of the things to play, you know, devil's advocate that I've been hearing is that at least here in Santa Clara County, it is difficult at times for women in the recovery 12-step community to find sponsors. For, you know, for females to be willing, older women to be able to have the time and the energy to actually do the sponsoring that we need.
Right. Can I say something? It's, you know, I was going to say, but even though the 12-step community, you know, we look at our old patterns of thinking and our old ways of behaving, and we reassess them, and through the steps we learn how to create new ways and new attitudes, and, you know, kind of release the old and bring on the new. But we need good models, even in that community.
Right.
And I think, you know, the controversy right now in the 12-step program about the terminology for higher power being sort of male-dominated, even now I'm hearing discussions and reactions to that. It's like women come to a place, I've seen this happen over and over again, personally and with a lot of other women. They come to a place in their recovery where they really need something. They need something that they can relate to, that reflects back to them their femininity, their sense of women.
Right.
And so, but I think that that's the place where you can first start to, you know, the women work with the women. You know,
Nice.
and you hear newcomers over and over come in and say, you know, oh, I hated women. I couldn't deal with women.
Yes,
I was afraid women were going to take what was mine.
Right.
And that, again, I could take that back to early childhood
Sure.
and look at, you know, relationships to society, not necessarily to the family system only.
Right.
You know?
Well, and we're also talking about at a corporate level too. The sense that there's not enough room, you know, because when we talk about corporate positions, you know, you're looking at women who still might only be 1%, or, you know, Fortune 500 companies who make it up to that management level.
Right.
And they don't necessarily bring other women with them. And I think it may speak to maybe that competitiveness that you're talking about, which is that there's only so many slots.
Right.
For women still. And so, you know, the reality is that if somebody's already in that slot, she may not necessarily choose to mentor another woman, because then they're competing with each other instead of this woman coming up competing with everyone. It's her competing with this other woman.
What I think is even worse than that, in my opinion, is what I see in women in my own groups, is the internalized patriarchy that these women adapt to go up that corporate ladder.
That's right, and somehow maybe sacrifice some of our
Sacrifice and lose themselves and disconnect with their femininity, their feminine side, in order to survive the patriarchal system.
Right,
I'm sorry to interrupt you. We are going to need to take a break, but we will come back.
Okay.
All right.
Do stay with us. When we return, we'll hear from the father of the men's movement, Robert Bly, about this issue. We'll see you in a minute.